Welcome everybody and welcome to our video series on forecasting delivered to you by the Center for Marketing, Analytics and Forecasting. So in this video today, I want to talk about some aspects of inventory management and forecasting and how these two are interrelated. I should say first that this is not going to be a comprehensive list. This is just, I'm talking about some aspects that I think are important. And since you've probably watched some of our videos before, you are probably familiar with some of the forecasting methods that we have already covered. So typically, a forecasting process follows different steps. So we need to start by specifying our forecasting needs. So for example, if we want to make inventory decisions and we need a forecast for that, then we should take that into account when we start the forecasting process. Then once we have identified what we want to forecast, we then start by exploring our data to identify structures such as trend or seasonality, and then we can use this information to build suitable models for forecasting, apply those models and make adjustments where necessary. In the end, we want to evaluate how good our forecast is, and depending on what we find out, whether we are happy with the result or whether we are not so happy and we think we should revisit our forecasting needs and respecify those. So this is the typical process that we go through, and in this short video today, I want to focus on the first 2 points, so specifying the forecasting needs if you want to make inventory decisions, and also the data exploration step. So let's start by specifying our forecasting needs. So we want to make inventory decisions. So what does that typically mean? First of all, we want to decide how often we review our inventory. So how often do we determine our inventory status to decide whether we need to order something? Then another important question is, when do we place an order? Should we place an order now or should we wait? And very importantly, how large should that order be? So how much do we actually want to order? So when we make that decision, then the inventory manager faces a trade-off between ordering too much and too little. So you could say that, okay, I want to satisfy all the demand that is possibly going to occur, so I'm just ordering a lot. However, you're not going to be very happy with this because it means that you might end up with a lot of leftover inventory. So for example, you might have a lot of fresh products left over, and maybe you can carry some of that over to the next period. But sometimes if it's a perishable product, some of that might actually perish, and then you have to throw the outdated products away. So you could say, okay, I don't want to go into this extreme, I'm going into the other extreme and I'm just not ordering anything. Again, not a very good decision because it means you won't be able to sell anything. So an inventory manager wants to find the right balance between these two extremes. So the inventory manager wants to find the balance between ordering too much and too little. So if we order too much, it means that we might have lots of leftover inventory. This can be costly because we need warehouse space or store. In a store, we need shelf space to keep all that inventory. Also, some of that products might outdate and perish, so there could be a cost for discarding the products, or maybe there is a salvage value where we can sell the products at a discount. On the other hand, if we don't order enough, then in that case there might be lost sales, so customers who come and they want to buy a product which is not there. So in that case the customer is unhappy and can't buy the product, or maybe they choose to buy a substitute product instead. Sometimes it's possible to place back orders, so in that case the company can place another order and then satisfy that demand later. But there is always a risk that the company might lose out on potential profits, and there could be a loss of customer goodwill also in the long run. So in all of these situations, one of the main issues is if the inventory manager does not know what the demand is going to be. So if the inventory manager doesn't know what the demand is going to be, they need a forecast because they need some kind of estimate what kind of demand to expect, especially if they have to place the order in advance before they observe the demand. So when the inventory manager wants to place an order and they need a forecast, we need to specify what kind of inventory decision they actually want to make. So when we specify those forecasting needs, we need to decide on what kind of level of aggregation we want to make a decision later on. So for example, if we're talking about a large company who has its own distribution centers, warehouses, stores, and so on, then that could mean that they need a forecast for the whole company, or it could be on a store level basis, one for the warehouse. So there are different levels of granularity. Similarly with respect to time units, so it could be that they need a very granular forecast, for example, hourly forecasts or maybe daily forecasts, but it could also be that maybe a weekly, monthly, or even an annual forecast is enough. And all of this is quite important to consider when we want to come up with a forecasting method, because the more aggregate it gets, there is no point in then making a very granular forecast, because it's going to be very difficult to come up with an exact forecast by, let's say, the hour or even the minute. And if we don't need that, then it would be easier to make a forecast for the day or the week. Another important question is, do we need a product-specific forecast, or are we looking at a group of products or an assortment or a whole store with many different products in there? So once we have identified what our forecasting needs are, and we start collecting data, and now we know what kind of data we want and what kind of level of granularity we need for our data, then we can start exploring that data. So when it comes to inventory, it can happen that a product stocks out. If there is a stock out, it means that we can't observe the full demand, so we only observe censored demand. So if you have point of sale scanner system where you record the sales data, then the observed sales are not necessarily the same as demand, because it could be that there was a stock out in the past. And if you only use the sales data without taking into account that this might be censored, then you would underestimate your demand for the future. So ideally, you would want to know what the actual demand is. And in order to do that, it would be quite useful to know, first of all, if there was a stock out. And you would think that maybe this is easy to do because you can just look at the inventory level. So how much inventory did I have available in a given time period, and how much did I sell? But very often, this is not as easy as that, because you might not have accurate inventory records. And it might even be difficult to determine what your current inventory is. So assuming you have detected a stock out, you would then move forward to estimate the demand. So rather than just using the sales data, which might be censored, it can be really useful to estimate the demand first, because then you don't risk underestimating your demand. So when it comes to stock out detection, we should always check what we think the inventory level was at that point in time. However, if you think of a product that perishes over time, and maybe there are more items that perish the longer you go into the future because the product gets older, it's also more difficult then to assess what you think your inventory level was at that time. Also, very often you don't have real-time information on your inventory levels. So again, you would need to assess that at regular time intervals. And then the question is, how accurate are your inventory records in between? So assuming we have been able to detect whether there was a stock out, we can then try to estimate what the demand would have been. And there is an approach in the literature where we can determine demand patterns based on days where demand was fully observable. So we take all the days where there was no stock out, and then we learn what the demand typically looks like throughout the day. So here you see a day from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. And what the demand pattern looks like over time. Now assume we have a day where sales stop at a certain time during the day, and we think that there is a stock out. Now we can use that typical demand pattern to estimate the demand. So we're now adding those unobservable lost sales, so what we could previously not observe, in order to get an estimate of our demand. However, there could also be another situation where another product has stocked out, and customers who wanted to buy that other product then chose this product instead. So this is called stockout-based substitution. And again, we could use this typical demand pattern to estimate what the original demand would have been for that product and how much additional demand was shifted due to the stockout-based substitution to that product. Now I want to conclude with a little thought experiment because this is something that people very often ask. So what happened if we ordered exactly our demand forecast? So wouldn't that be easy, right? We just take the demand forecast as it is and use that as our order quantity. If we are lucky and demand is exactly what our forecast was, then we would have a perfect match. However, we know that forecasts are often wrong, so this is quite unlikely. So there are two other situations that we might face. So what if our demand is bigger than the forecast that we assumed? In that case, we would have an underage cost because we weren't able to satisfy that demand. Another alternative outcome could be that our demand is smaller than our forecast, and in that case we would have an overage cost because we wouldn't be able to sell everything that we ordered. So in order to make a good decision of where we want to be with our order quantity, for example, is it more costly to have underages than overage costs or vice versa, it's important to understand how much uncertainty is in our data. So if we compare two different products and the product 1 has less variability than product 2, and we assume that we want to achieve that for both products we can satisfy the demand on 90 out of 100 periods, so that means we have a 90% in-stock probability, then in that case the product which is more variable requires larger order quantities than the product with less variability, because we need to keep more safety stock to capture that additional variability of the demand. So to summarize, what is really important is that forecasting should not be viewed in isolation from the decisions that it is going to be used for later on. So it's really important to take into account what I want to achieve with that forecast. On the other hand, the inventory decisions can actually affect the demand data. So for example, if I didn't order enough in the past, then I might face stockouts now, and or if I underestimated demand and didn't forecast the right amount, then in that case I'm more likely to observe a stock out later on, and this would result to demand censoring. Really importantly, demand variability, because this is important for setting safety stocks and to make sure that I can capture the variability of the demand. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoy our series on forecasting videos, And if you want to find out more about CMAF, then please join us through this QR code or link.